Coming up on the Sky News Daily with me, Neil Paterson, Ukraine peace talks, but what hope for a ceasefire when neither Trump nor Putin have shown up? Some pretty important talks taking place in Turkey right now. Plenty, of course, want an end to the war between Russia and Ukraine, yet the summit hasn't been quite as well attended as some had hoped. Volodymyr Zelenskyy is there, of course. He said he would be just as soon as it was announced. But for now, at least, he's a bit of a Billy No-Mates, with neither Donald Trump nor Vladimir Putin choosing to pitch up. Instead, a Russian delegation, which the Ukrainian president has described as stand-in props. So as we wait to see what emerges from Turkey, why don't we see what the mood is in Ukraine itself? Our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn, is in Kyiv. Good to see you, mate. Look, so often when we talk, it is about what's happening on the front line, the kinetic, the war itself. But step away from that just for a second and tell me, you're in Kyiv right now. How does it feel to be in Ukraine when it is still technically, well, definitely at war with Russia?
Here in Kyiv, you wouldn't really know the war is going on apart from the fact that statues remain boarded up and the odd siren is happening. So normal life goes on, but I think it's a sort of uneasy hiatus because I think Ukrainians are watching very closely what's going on with the diplomacy and wondering what happens next. And I think, I think the way they're reading it, the Ukrainians, is that their president has played a bit of a blinder. He has called Putin's bluff. He's gone to Turkey, and he's, after Putin said that he would send a delegation to discuss peace directly and at a high level, in response, trying to swerving the European allies' attempts to bring about an unconditional ceasefire. Zelenskyy saw that, raised it and said, well, I'm going to go to Istanbul, and Putin is now, we know, not going to go. So I think that the Ukrainians feel they're on the moral high ground. They're keen, obviously, not to overplay their hand, but they know it's really down to how Donald Trump views this. And I think their fear will be, of course, that once this diplomatic kind of charade, if you like, which is what many people see it as now, plays out in Turkey, then the Russians may come back and attack their cities with a vengeance. And the other thing they know is that on the front line, the Russians are building up considerable forces at a number of points to go for a major sort of push in the summer. So it's a kind of, I guess, a bit of a false calm, a kind of lull before the storm that I think Ukrainians kind of feel inevitably is going to come their way again.
But just to dig down into the Ukrainian psyche right now, I mean, this war has gone on for an awful long time. There can't be many people that you meet that haven't got a direct connection to the front line, either through having been there themselves, knowing someone who's been there themselves, or knowing someone who has died there. I mean, are Ukrainians just getting sick of this constant conflict?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure. Of course they are. They're absolutely, sick to the back teeth of it. And I think they are desperate for it to be over, and they are hoping beyond hope that this kind of window that Donald Trump seems to have opened up could lead somewhere. But I think also they're very sort of skeptical about the chances of it succeeding. They've seen false dawns in the past. They've seen the Russians make sort of hollow promises that have turned out to be nothing. They've seen ceasefires that the Russians have agreed to or have announced themselves be sort of exploited cynically by the Russians, who've either used them to fire drones or to move their forces around or to carry out reconnaissance and replace their forces. So, they've learned to become pretty cynical about the chances of peace. They are obviously hoping that this diplomacy can lead somewhere. But I think, they're well aware that it is unlikely. And I think they're also aware that the mediator, the man who sort of has opened up this window towards peace, Donald Trump, seems to be very biased towards the Russians and also has a very short attention span. I think their fear is that he will walk away eventually. That threat's kind of receded for now, but I think they still feel that at some point he will just throw his hands up in despair. And he seems to regard both Russia and Ukraine as kind of equal partners in this war. And, Steve Witkoff, his chief negotiator, gave an interview in the Middle East a day or so ago, where he said the same thing. He said, all you need to do is get Russia and Ukraine into the same room, get them to sort of get over their hatred. Of course, they hate each other because of this terrible war, but eventually they can thrash out their differences. For Ukrainians, that is extraordinary because, it doesn't seem to take into account at all that the Russians are the aggressor in this war, that they have bombed Ukrainian homes, that they've taken tens of thousands of children, that they have taken thousands of civilians, and that their latest peace plan Putin sort of sending his negotiators to Istanbul with, just reiterates his original claims back in 2022, which is that Ukraine has no right to exist and should be absorbed into Russia, and is demanding yet again the complete capitulation of Ukraine. So I think they're pretty clear-eyed about both their enemy, but also the man who sort of set himself up as the mediator in this war for now at least.
Sure, I suppose the what I'm driving at is what level of fatigue is there amongst ordinary Ukrainians? Is there an appetite for this war to be ended as soon as possible, to the extent that we could see Ukraine giving up significant parts of its territory?
I mean, it varies a lot. I think it depends on possibly where you are in Ukraine, and how involved you are directly personally in the war. Do you have relatives fighting? Is the land on the other side of this line of contact that may end up being given to the Russians, at least for now, that you own or your family owns? How do you feel about that idea of trading land for peace? I think that sort of the bottom line, and it varies enormously, obviously, it's a very big country, but the bottom line will be they want peace, but they don't want a false, hollow peace. They don't want a kind of peace that will deliver a kind of frozen conflict for a few years that actually might strengthen the Russians. They are well aware that they're up against a leader, an enemy who doesn't think their country has a right to exist, believes it should be absorbed into Russia, and has really militarized his economy. So the idea, I think, of a false, phony peace for the Ukrainians is pretty terrifying, because they know it would give Putin a few more years during which his economy, which is militarized, could pump out more tanks, more shells, could allow him to mobilize many, many more men, and then allow him to come back for more, to attack them again. I think they are pretty clear-eyed about what the danger is in terms of a negotiated peace that will only last a few years. And I think they're anxious about where Donald Trump and his negotiators are taking this, because they don't see them, at the moment at least, as honest brokers in this process that they've begun.
But do you honestly think, Dom, having spoken to many Ukrainians over the course of this conflict, that they would be able to cede in legal terms that territory of Crimea, which has long been held by Russia, more than a decade now? Would they see that as capitulation, or the price worth paying?
If there's going to be a peace, it's going to involve giving up land for now, at least. It's basically politically impossible for Zelenskyy to cede sovereignty on any of his land, and arguably it's constitutionally illegal to do so. So the idea that Trump and Steve Witkoff have put out there is that the Americans will recognize Crimea effectively as Russian. So by de jure will cede sovereignty, in the American mind at least, to the Russians. That's something that Zelenskyy publicly can't obviously accept, and in any peace deal can't really accept it either. But I think, the principle that they will have to give up land for now, as we've heard from Zelenskyy, to hope that they can win back diplomatically at some point, is something that Ukrainians, I think, begrudgingly are kind of coming to accept. But they're only going to do that if they believe it's worth it. And they'll only do that if they believe that they get proper security guarantees to guarantee that Putin doesn't come back for more in a few years time. They know that this is someone who, if he's not deterred, will come back and attack them again. So they need to have very firm security guarantees. And what they're hearing from the Americans and the Europeans, I think, at the moment, is not very reassuring on that front at all. So yes, they definitely want peace, but not on any terms.
Dom, you've said it on this podcast and on previous podcasts, the view of Volodymyr Zelenskyy amongst ordinary Ukrainians. He is feted, he is praised. But are there any signs that his popularity might in certain quarters be waning, just because of the length of this war, because of the fact that there will have to be concessions made, because of the fact he's pitched up for peace talks and Putin hasn't?
Yeah, I mean, I think the impression we get in the West is that Zelenskyy is this great hero, and obviously he's seen as Churchillian outside of Ukraine. But actually inside Ukraine, there's all the kind of push and pull of domestic politics going on. This is a country under enormous strain. And so that does lead to pressures and criticisms about the leader. And before the bust up in the Oval Office, actually he was beginning to flag in the polls, and some of his political rivals were beginning to pull ahead a bit of him. One of his proposals, or his government's proposals, has been to deal with the mobilization, the manpower problem the Ukrainians have. The Russians have sort of no problem with manpower. They have a lot of problems in getting enough tanks and artillery to the battlefield. It's the opposite on the Ukrainian side. So one of the solutions that Zelensky has come forward with is that men are given a year in service, probably at the front line for at least half of it at least, and then they're going to be able to leave the country for years, for 2 or 3 years after that, and they'll be paid pretty well for it. Now, that's an inducement to get Ukrainians to join the armed forces and sign up. He doesn't want to force conscription because that would be politically very difficult for him. But if you've been fighting on the front for 2 or 3 years, or your father, or your father, or your husband has, or your brother has, then that is politically very unpopular. So that's caused problems. So Zelensky has been challenged and beginning to flag in the polls, but that was before the bus stop in the Oval Office. And that big row with J.D. Vance and Donald Trump has kind of reversed or reinforced his standing in the polls. So he's now pretty unassailable and popular because, the Ukrainians do not like their leaders being bullied on the public stage in the way that the American president and vice president did. So Zelensky's he's been under pressure, but he's now, I think, pretty unassailable. And that gives him a kind of mandate, I think, to go to Istanbul and take the moral high ground. And I think what he's done is being seen as pretty clever by his people here. I think they saw Putin swerve that unconditional ceasefire demand with an attempt to try and lure Ukraine into direct negotiations. And then Zelensky kind of pushed back and said, well, if you want negotiations, I'm going to go, let's do it face to face. And now Putin sort of hiding in the Kremlin and keeping us guessing as to whether he's going or not. And then it seems he's decided he's not going to go. Ukrainians are having a field day on social media with pictures of chickens and pictures of Zelensky waiting at the airport, holding up a sign like a taxi driver with Putin written on it. I mean, they are clearly making the most of this. And that's going to make him even more popular. And what's really crucial, actually, is what is happening in the mind of Donald Trump. He's always given the Russians the kind of benefit of the doubt in this diplomatic process. It's going to be very important, I think, for the Ukrainians to play ball, to send negotiators to meet the officials that Putin has sent in his stead, however unpalatable that prospect is. And so they can try and keep that moral high ground in what I think is basically sort of performative diplomacy going on.
I mean, Dom, I think I've got a fairly clear idea now of the Ukrainian perspective on both Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. But how about the European Union? How about the United Kingdom? How are we being viewed there?
I think you've gone from a real fear the Europeans would not stand firm with Ukraine and that they would be fractured apart by a Russian leader, an enemy who's very good at dividing and ruling. And I think they've been really reassured that over this war that's gone on for more than 3 years now, the European leaders have stood firmly and they formed this coalition of the willing. And we saw leaders of France, Britain, Germany and Poland over the weekend coming here and standing with Zelensky. So that has kind of reassured them and given them, consolation. But I think the bottom line for Ukrainians is they know that Europe is economically, 10 times at least stronger than Russia. And they're very impatient with the fact that the Europeans have not really used that economic superiority, massive, overwhelming economic superiority as leverage to give the Ukrainians more. And I think they feel that what Donald Trump has done recently in sort of suggesting that America kind of recedes from supporting Ukraine, the possibility that America will actually pull out, that Donald Trump will not support Ukraine anymore and is certainly pulling out in terms of a security footprint in Europe. They kind of see that as, or they hope that's going to galvanize Europeans to do more. And I think what is crucial right now is how the Europeans react to what Putin's done with these demands for a ceasefire. On Saturday, we had Keir Starmer, we had Friedrich Merz, we had Donald Tusk, and we had Emmanuel Macron stand in the presidential palace in Kyiv and say, no ifs, no buts. This is the last chance for Vladimir Putin. He's got to sign up to an unconditional 30-day ceasefire. If he doesn't, he clearly doesn't want peace. Well, he's rejected that. He has broken that ceasefire that's been imposed upon him to some extent. He has been firing drones. And I think, if this rejection of this idea continues by the Russians, which is expected to continue, the Europeans have got to come up with some kind of punishment for that. And they've threatened sanctions. They've threatened to give the Ukrainians more military aid. And I think the Ukrainians are expecting them to be good to their word, whether or not Donald Trump does the same. The Americans have kind of signed up to that in principle, but then given the Russians a way out. So I think Ukrainians are pretty, clear-eyed about what they think Donald Trump's up to. but they really want to have support from the Europeans, and they believe that they have that commitment and they expect them to follow up on it. The Ukrainians, I think, will carry on fighting as long as they have a chance of repelling the invaders.
Thanks, Dom. And for the very latest on the talks, just head to the website, skynews.com. The Daily's back tomorrow.
The first 100 days might be over, but President Trump is showing no signs of slowing down.
America will soon be greater than ever before.
So we're continuing to follow every twist and turn of this remarkable presidency.
And trying to make sense of what it all means for the US and for the rest of the world.
So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Malika Kellner.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Sky News Trump 100, wherever you get your podcasts.